Our Open Book, Open Mind series is funded through the generosity of the Montclair Public Library Foundation through its donors, as well as through grants from the Montclair Foundation and Investors Foundation.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Peter mentioned, my name is Carly Garcia. I have the privilege of sitting on Peter's foundation board. So we work together with the community to raise funds for the library and create interesting events like this one. Another great chapter in our Open Book, Open Mind series. This evening I have the honor of introducing Joanne Lipman, former Chief Content Officer of Gannett and Editor-in-Chief of USA Today and the USA Today Network, to discuss her new book, That's What She Said, What Men Need to Know and Women Need to Tell Them About Working Together. Joanne began her career as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, ultimately rising to Deputy Managing Editor, the first woman to attain this post, and supervising coverage that won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. She was a founding editor-in-chief of Condé Nast Portfolio magazine and Portfolio.com, which won a Loeb and National Magazine Awards. Joanne will be in conversation with Edward Felsenthal, Time Magazine's editor-in-chief, and lucky for us, a Montclair resident. Previously, Edward was a former editor of the Wall Street Journal, serving as the founding editor of Personal Journal, where he guided the paper to 2 Pulitzer Prizes and was one of the founding editors of the Daily Beast. Needless to say, the dialogue around sexual harassment is a watershed moment for our time. Now has come the next step, men and women working together to solve the problem. If this moment has taught us one thing, it's that this isn't a female problem, it's also a male problem. That's What She Said is a clarion call by a veteran journalist, Joanne Lipman, for how men can join the conversation to close the gender gap, including steps that they can take right now, alongside women to move towards a solution. Lipman goes beyond the current focus on sexual harassment to examine the broader culture. I was asked to introduce our guest tonight by my foundation board colleague, Jennifer Dorr, who noted that I've spent the majority of my career so far in a male-dominated industry. But if you think about it, haven't most women? Publishers Weekly said, Lipman makes a bold statement with this important book examining biases favoring men in business. This book goes a step further than Sheryl Sandberg's best-selling Lean In, and challenges both men and women to examine their own prejudices and actively reshape work cultures to be more welcoming to women. Please join me in welcoming 2 remarkable people, and note that Watch Young Booksellers will have the book available for purchase, and Joanne just told me signature at the end. Enjoy.
Women have been talking about all of these issues that we face at work for years. I mean, things like being overlooked and underestimated, feeling marginalized, feeling not heard, and less respected than our male colleagues. And we talk about all these things to each other, but not to men. And my feeling was that women talking to each other is half a conversation. And at best, we can get to half a solution. It's perfectly good guys who actually would want to be our allies in closing the gap. And the second is that a lot of men were clueless about the issues that are facing women. And in fact, Catalyst, which is a nonprofit that studies working women, did a survey of men, of executive men, and they asked the question, what might prevent you from being a champion of equality in the workplace? And 74% of the men they asked cited fear. And part of it was fear of loss of status among other men. And part of it was fear of saying the wrong thing. And I think a lot of women have experienced that, where you're in a mixed group and the issue of, God forbid, gender, workplace equality, one of those things comes up, and a lot of the men will just clam up and fearful of saying the wrong thing, fearful like, this isn't my issue, what if I step in it, what if she yells at me? And the idea with That's What She Said is, let's get beyond that. I want to erase the fear.
Has the post-Harvey Weinstein Me Too movement made that harder or easier?
Yeah, so you can look at it in 2 ways. So on the one hand, you do hear about stories about men saying, well, now I'm never going to talk to a woman, because if I do, who knows what will happen? Maybe she's going to accuse me of something. You hear about men who are saying, now I'm looking back at my 20-year career saying, uh-oh, did I do anything that maybe will be misconstrued that suddenly is going to come back from my past? So you hear some of that, but on the other hand, you also have a situation where now it's much more open to discussion. And I think that is a fantastic, the fact that you and I are talking about this issue in front of a mixed gender audience is amazing. And it's something that didn't used to happen. One great example of that was, this actually just happened a couple weeks ago. So the book grew out of, I'd written actually an article in the Wall Street Journal 3 years ago called Women at Work, A Guide for Men. And that piece went viral and that led ultimately to That's What She Said. And at the time when I wrote that article, I was invited on some television programs to talk about it. And one of the ones I went on was Squawk Box on CNBC, business morning show. And CNBC has 3 anchors, 2 men and a woman. And the 2 men talk tons, very, very chatty. And the woman, you know, she's great, Becky Quick, I think she's local here. But in any case, when I went on that program to talk 3 years ago, the 2 men basically sat on their hands. They had the, you can see it, they had that like deer in the headlights look, and didn't speak. So fast forward 3 years, and the book just came out, and I was invited back to go on Squawk Box, and this time the men couldn't stop talking. They were really eager participants, they were curious, there was no defensiveness, there was none of that. It was just a great back and forth conversation, and that's the best possible case that we can get out of Me Too, is to make this discussable.
Why did you name it that? What's the title?
So That's What She Said is, some of you may know, it is a dirty joke. Some of you may not know that, but...
My kids are in the audience. You can Google it later.
But it's a double entendre. It comes from The Office, by the way, the dirty joke. And my son, who as a teenager would walk around saying that. That's what she said. But it has a double entendre because I think every woman, and actually I should do a show of hands among the women here. I actually want to ask a question. So have you ever been in a meeting or a group, the women in the audience, where you've said something and it seems like it's crickets. It's like nobody heard it. And then 2 minutes later, some man repeats exactly what you just said. And all of a sudden, like, Bob is a genius. Wow, what a great idea. So, show of hands, anyone? Yeah. I think that would be 100% of the women here. And that's where That's What She Said comes from. Because every woman in the room is scratching their head, saying, wait a second, that's what she said. He's getting the credit for it. And it's actually one of those things that's happened to me and that I thought has happened to me multiple times. And I always thought it was me. And as I was doing the research for That's What She Said, I found that so many things that I thought were my problem, that were just me, are actually common to almost all women. And that is one of them. And there's actually research behind it that shows that when women make up a third or less of an audience, literally their voices are actually not heard. The ear is attuned to the male voice. And it is actually true that she's not heard. And so it's one of those things that we experience, but once you're aware of it, you can do something about it. You can counteract it, you can listen for it, and then take actions to fix the problem.
So the book, which I highly recommend, there are surprises and disturbing facts and statistics, page after page after page, that change what you thought you knew, or at least what I thought I knew. But maybe the most vivid of them to me, and I put them on a slide, a few slides, is, we know, and Joanne writes a lot about human bias, the biases that we have in our everyday interactions. You might think algorithms could help change that, but when, I'll let you explain to us, Joanne, what is this?
So this is what happens. So there's 2 things that go on with algorithms. First of all, algorithms are written by humans. They're a language. And so like any language, they reflect the programmers who program them. So most programmers are male. And so you can actually have bias in your programming. But you could also say Google will deliver search results based on what people are searching for, and it is sort of a reflection of our inner selves, of our deep innermost thoughts. So this was, when I was working on the book, I just Googled doctor, and you can see what you get. I mean, my doctors are all women. I don't see them here. Also, it's mostly white guys. So then I Googled, I believe nurses came next, is that right? Nurse, there we go. So there you go, that's all women, which actually nursing is primarily women, but I will tell you one thing about nursing is even though it is largely a female field, male nurses earn more than female nurses. And if that is true for almost every field there is. There was a study of almost 500 different professions, and men out-earn women in all but about 3 of them.
There's also, you mentioned in the book that women doctors are more often called by their first name as opposed to men who are a doctor.
Yes, men are called by the honorific doctor. Women are generally introduced by their first names. Yeah. So then I Googled Hollywood agent because I was going to see my agents who did the book. So I wanted to see all of my agents, all the people who have worked with me on the book, who I love. Every single one of them is female. So I thought, I wonder what happens when you Google agent. And literally, it's like Ari Gold and a bunch of guys who look just like him in real life. Yeah.
CEO.
Oh, CEO, yes, that was another one. Okay, so I did this for the book. Okay, this was amazing to me. I put in just CEO. The only woman, notice, on this first page of Google results, CEO Barbie. I did this again recently because I did this for the books, which was before, I wrote before Me Too. And I Googled it again yesterday because I wanted to see, I said, I thought for sure things would have changed by now, right? Because there's been so much emphasis on women and women in the workplace, and I thought for sure we would see a lot of positive change. But when I Googled it yesterday, it wasn't CEO Barbie, but there was only one female still on the front page of CEO.
What's the percentage of women who run Fortune 500 companies?
Well, it's 5%. It is 5%. But there are an awful lot of, that's of Fortune 500 companies. Which is another thing, one of the reasons that people give that you hear very frequently in male-dominated industries and in male-dominated professions is that it's a pipeline issue. And I sort of take apart the pipeline issue, which is BS, because I take that apart and that's what she said. But one of the examples I use is with CEOs because the average CEO is 55 years old. So that means the average CEO graduated from college a little over 30 years ago. A little over 30 years ago is when women became 50% of all college graduates. So if the pipeline issue, if that was a true issue, by now actually 50% of all CEOs would be female, and instead it's 5%.
And law firms?
Law firms is the same story. Law firms, female women about 25 years ago became the majority of law school students, and yet are only, I believe it's 19%, something like that. I think it's 9% of equity partners and 19% of all partners. So again, pipeline theory doesn't hold. And I know that the reason behind that has always been, you always hear, well, you know, women in their 30s, when they want to take off because they get married, they have children, they're really focused on other things, they're focused on raising their kids. But Harvard Business School, and I cite this in That's What She Said, Harvard Business School actually did a study of 30 years of its own graduates, and it found that at every age, the women lagged behind the men in career achievement, and it did not matter whether these women chose to get married or have children. In other words, those who didn't marry, didn't have children, they still faced a career gap that they couldn't close.
I think I have one more. Oh, good.
Oh yeah, female bosses.
The book is mostly about gender, but I thought this is
yes, yeah, I can talk
quite telling. Yeah.
Yeah. So the book is about gender, but one of the things that I found in researching That's What She Said was that so many of the issues and so much of the research that I cite actually was done not just regarding women, but underrepresented groups. And we're talking, you know, racial, ethnicity, sexuality, and so many of the things that we talk about in That's What She Said apply to any underrepresented group. And this was a particularly scary and frightening reminder of that, which is here are two people after Katrina in exactly the same position. And I don't know if you can read, but the top one is African American, and the bottom one is a nice white couple, and they're doing exactly the same thing. And the top one, the caption says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. And the bottom one says, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. Well, the media, of which Edward and I are major participants, you know, we are faulted in this as well. You know, on the gender side of the equation, one of the really interesting things to me, Edward and I spent many years together at the Wall Street Journal and covering business, and one of the really interesting studies that I ran across found that when a company fails, if it's led by a female CEO, 80% of news reports blame the CEO. Whereas if a company is failing or doing poorly and it's led by a man, only a small minority of news reports actually put the blame on the man. So the woman in charge, you know, gets disproportionately targeted.
We're going to get to solutions. But,
there are solutions.
There are solutions.
There's a happy story here.
But one of the things I found particularly depressing reading the book is that a number of the institutions that you would think, hope, predict were at the forefront of change are not always for a lack of effort failing. And you spend a lot of time at Google, which I think of, I mean, it's various mottos about improving the world.
Don't be evil.
Produced Sheryl Sandberg, Marissa Mayer, Susan Wojcicki, I mean, really phenomenal female leaders, and yet still 70% male. And there's a great scene in the book where you describe an office at Google that reminds you of your son's bedroom because it's got, you know, Lego tech heroes made of Lego, and it's very male.
Yes.
And I guess my reaction was, Google can't figure this out. But tell us about your experiences with them.
Well, I spent time with Google and with Facebook and with some other Silicon Valley firms, and we know that they are, you know, overwhelmingly male, and there are many reasons behind it. What I found really interesting is that, you know, they are also, some of the people there who I spent time with are also at the forefront of trying to change things. And they are the most aggressive of probably all industries when it comes to unconscious bias training. So unconscious bias is a lot of the stuff that we just saw. Unconscious bias are these biases we have very deep inside of us that so deeply we don't even know that they exist. And the idea behind unconscious bias training is if you're aware of the biases, you can do something to counteract them. And I actually took unconscious bias training at Facebook with its employees, which was interesting. But you know, the issue is that I think change needs to come not from your HR department. Change has to come from your CEO and your CFO, Chief Financial Officer. It has to come from the top of any organization. And the reason is that it has to be, you have to understand that it's in the fabric of your organization, but you also need to understand those people at the top need to think of it as their responsibility. And in too many companies that I have seen, and too many organizations, period, that I've seen, it's sort of outsourced to HR or whatever the equivalent department is. And any kind of training like that is limited by, you know, it's a couple of hours in your day or a couple of days. And it can, in fact, it can backfire. It can actually backfire. One of the studies that I cited in That's What She Said looked at diversity training. Has anybody here taken diversity training in your company? Oh, like a lot, okay. Has anybody taken unconscious bias training as opposed to diversity training? Fewer. So the unconscious bias training is the new thing. The diversity training, those of you who took it will be interested to know, has failed, totally failed. The Harvard professor studied 30 years of diversity training, looking at over 700 companies that did it over a 30-year period. And he found that for women, as well as for African American women and men, for those two groups of people, it actually made things worse. In other words, had there been no training whatsoever, those two groups would have advanced further in the workplace than than they did with diversity training. And there were a variety of reasons for why that was, but one of the main reasons was resentment on the part of the men who were forced to take the training. And that's a real thing. And in fact, their resentment was not misplaced. I actually talked to a veteran diversity trainer. Diversity training really, in its kind of current format, really came out in the 1970s, when they're before everyone's time here. In the 1970s, there were a bunch of lawsuits, and Newsweek, the Women in Newsweek, and the New York Times, and various other places, and in other industries as well. And that led to diversity training, and it was for legal compliance. And as this veteran diversity trainer said to me, when we designed it basically, we were banging white guys over the head with a 2x4 and making them feel guilty. That's what we were trying to do. And he said, and if they cried, all the better. So, so that diversity training really had the opposite effect, and in fact was the catalyst for, that's what she said. It actually, this whole journey for me started before I wrote this article. The reason I wrote the article that led to the book was because I was speaking at a women's conference, and I was on a flight. It was in Des Moines. I was on a flight to Des Moines, and I found myself sitting next to this very, very lovely guy from Westchester, which is not as good as Montclair, but it's okay. But anyway, he had just bought a new house in Westchester and was telling me about the house and the kids and the sports teams. And we had our little plastic glasses of white wine. We were having like the nicest conversation. And then he said, why are you going to Des Moines? And I said, I'm going to speak at a women's leadership conference. And all of a sudden, this lovely man just like freezes. And he says, he gets that look and he goes, sorry, I'm a man. And then he launches into this whole thing about how he had just gone through a couple of days of diversity training, and he said it was like going to the principal's office or getting sat in the corner, and he said he came out of it with one message, and the one message was, it's all your fault. And that really stuck with me. I thought that's ridiculous. And then the next day, I was speaking at this leadership conference, and it's a ballroom full of women, and as I'm talking about these concepts, these challenges that women face, the not being heard, and all of these things that we're talking about, and I'm watching like a sea of heads, female heads nodding, and I stopped right in the middle of a sentence, and I said, you know what? We all know this. We actually need men in the room to hear this. And that was sort of the aha moment to write the piece that led to the book.
All of this starts really young, right? I mean,
yes.
You spend a lot of time in the book detailing the ways we treat our girls and our boys differently, the different ways they play. Talk about that, but the question that leapt to me after I read that section was, should we be teaching our girls to be more like our boys, or our boys to be more like our girls, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
I think that's, well,
it's okay if it's the wrong way to think about it.
There's probably a different way to think about it. But just to your point about how all this starts, and I should say that's what she said is full of stories. Like I wanted to there's tons and tons of data and research, but it's really told through stories. And I crisscrossed the country and actually the world, the globe, primarily seeking out men who were trying to close the gap, to see what have they learned, what are some things that we can learn from them, best practices, so that we can all work together to close the gap. But one of the things in my research that I found was, even though we're focused on the workplace, all of this it does not start in the workplace. It starts way, 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 way before, even in infancy. So one of the more surprising pieces of research I found was that mothers routinely overestimate how quickly their sons begin to crawl, but they underestimate how quickly their daughters begin to crawl. And then parents of 2-year-olds who type into Google, is my child a genius? More than twice as likely to do that for a boy 2-year-old than a girl 2-year-old. One of the most interesting pieces.
My little geniuses are right there. You're both girls.
Little geniuses. At 6 years old, there was a study done of first graders taking a math test. And they took a math test and their names were taken off the papers. Because math, you would think, okay, black and white, right? Their names were taken off. They were graded by first grade teachers, all women, by the way. and the girls outscored the boys. Then those same papers had the names added back in. This time the boys outscored the girls. So there's these unconscious biases that infect us all the way through that we're not aware of, and that by the time you get to college age, a female college student needs to have an A average to be seen as the equal of a boy student with a B average. And that translates directly into everything that we see in the workplace. So it starts super young. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do about it. I mean, because once you are aware, there are things, 100 things a day that we all do, that once we have an awareness of them, we can actually stop ourselves. I mean, you know, the equivalent of, I talked to male managers who talk about how they had to, once they were aware of how they were treating male and female employees differently, they realized they were giving constructive feedback to the men and giving like personal feedback to women, like you're abrasive and you know you're bossy, as opposed to constructive. And so, but once they were aware of it, they were able to kind of look at it and make sure that they were giving equivalent feedback. Well, a mom can do the same thing with the infant who's crawling. A teacher can do the same thing with who she is calling on in a classroom. I mean, women are now 60% of college undergraduates, and yet professors call on male students more frequently than they call on female students. But once you're aware of it, there are things that you can do to make sure that you're being more equitable about it. Harvard Business School actually puts cameras in the back of the classrooms, and in part for that reason, to make sure that the professors can review and see that they're doing.
There's a point in the book where you write about Harvard Business School, and I think you're talking to a dean or a professor there who says, notes that women professors are submitting papers at a much slower rate than male professors because they think it has to be perfect.
Yes.
And I wondered as I read that, like, when did that feeling begin? You know, it didn't begin at Harvard Business School or in academia, right?
Right. It starts really early on, and it starts with how women value themselves. There was a study done on, because this goes back to women valuing themselves and women being told all the time, well, there's a pay gap, just demand to be paid what you're worth. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that and other women have heard that. There's books written about that. But my research suggests that women don't always know what we are worth. And that starts young. So these 6-year-olds were asked to do a task, first graders, and then they were told that they should pay themselves in Hershey Kisses. At 6 years old, the boys pay themselves more Hershey Kisses than the girls do. So they repeat that with money in middle school and high school. The boys pay themselves as much as 78% more than girls. So again, the girls are not necessarily certain what they're worth. And women, the research will show you, actually value sort of outside affirmation more than men do. So for example, when a woman isn't given a promotion or a raise, she internalizes it and puts her head down and thinks she has to work harder. Men generally, and I'm speaking in general terms, but generally this is the way the trends go. Men, the research shows you, if they are turned down, will more frequently threaten to leave because their assumption is the other guy's wrong. And that actually adds to the pay disparity. This was really interesting. In the UK, there's a law now where you have to publicize your wage gap. And when PwC, a big consulting firm, did that, and they knew what their wage gap was. And, but they told me, like, publicizing it was highly motivating. Because it made them really dig in and make sure they knew how to fix it and look for where were the hiccups. And they found one of the major reasons for their wage gap in the UK was for that very reason, is that at the partnership level, one level below partnership, women who were passed over for partnership were personally mortified and put their heads down and kept quiet and worked really hard to hopefully make partner the next year. The men who didn't make partner at that same time threatened to leave and said, I'm going to go work somewhere else. You don't value me, I'm leaving. And they all got big bonuses. And that's where a huge part of the pay disparity came from. So there's a thing called, and something I suffered from for my entire life, called tiara syndrome. I don't know, has anyone heard of tiara syndrome? So tiara syndrome is something that impacts women more than men, which is women waiting to be given the raise, given the promotion, given the outside affirmation, as opposed to men who sort of internalize that they deserve it. And it is, again, there's reams of research that shows, and it goes back to childhood, it goes back to the way we learn how to play as children even.
I really do want to get to solutions in 1 second. But, there's so many moments in the book where it's like a gut punch, and one of them, jumping off what you've been talking about just now, is what you note that Hillary Clinton was the first presidential candidate in history to say "I'm sorry" in a concession speech.
Yes. So there are different speech patterns for men and women. Again, this goes back to childhood, as so many of the things we're talking about. So girls learn how to play by being collaborative and extending a hand and suggesting things. Boys learn how to play games where there's a winner and a loser. And that translates directly into adult life. And one of the things that in the first chapter, I have a chapter called The Secret Lives of Women, and it's about the 1,000 tiny things that women do all day long to fit in a work world of men. There's so many things that we do, but one of them is female speech patterns are actually different than male speech patterns. So, and it stems from childhood. So women are much more likely to use hedging language, like, I hate to bother you, but I'm sorry, but, you know, is it okay? And we do apologize all the time, and we are not sorry. And yet we do it. And not surprisingly, Hillary Clinton became the first presidential candidate to say, I am sorry, in an acceptance speech. We also say, the other thing we say all the time is, I'm lucky. So again, there's research behind this that shows that women tend to attribute their success to luck, whereas men tend to attribute it to grit and intelligence. And that is, if you've ever seen, you know, there's a wonderful organization called New York Women in Communications that hosts an award ceremony every year. It's usually like the Waldorf Ballroom. It's like 1,500 women in a ballroom, and it's all these amazing women who you admire from afar, who are like up on stage getting honored, and every one of them says, I'm lucky. And Lena Dunham, who was honored last year, like, she's the very model of a modern feminist. Twice said she was lucky in her speech, and you just don't hear that from men at the same level. And women are highly aware of this, and we really try and change our speech patterns. There's women I heard of as researching the book who have a sorry jar on their desk where you have to put a buck in every time you say you're sorry. And there's actually a Google extension you can download that for women that puts a squiggly underline as if you've misspelled it every time you use hedging language, like hate to bother you kind of language.
So want to get to questions, but let's talk about how we fix all of this.
Yes.
You write about Iceland and totally fascinating. Because you went to Iceland,
yep.
And in Iceland, at least the way I read it, it's almost like overnight a Viking culture. I know it's a little more nuanced than this, but it's a very male-dominated culture. The financial crash happens, and suddenly the world changes. Is that going to happen here, or what do we do here?
Yeah. So the reason I went to Iceland because it's the #1 country in the world for gender equality, and it became the #1 country in the world for gender equality in 2009, and that was not an accident. It was after 2008, the financial crisis hit the United States really hard. It hit Iceland even worse. In the United States, bankers kept their jobs, the government, went along, chugging along. In Iceland, all 3 bank CEOs, there's 3 major banks, all 3 lost their jobs and went to jail. 2 of the 3 were replaced by women. The government was toppled and replaced by a female prime minister. And the country actually went and the government hired a couple of gender studies professors from the University of Iceland to study why Iceland crashed so hard. And the gender studies professors had a major report, and it basically boiled down to an excess of testosterone. And they were just making gigantic bets, and they were it was a nation of fishermen and farmers who all became hedge fund managers. And were filled with hubris and didn't know what they were doing, and it turned into a massive bubble. And so they really overhauled the whole country. I do not expect that that will happen here. Likely not going to happen here. But there are an awful lot of things on the plus side. There are so many solutions. I actually have a cheat sheet in the back of the book, just sort of outlining some of the lessons learned, for which, by the way, I give credit to my husband, who is out here in the audience. Here he is. Who read an early version of the manuscript and said, just tell me what to do. But that cheat sheet has proven incredibly valuable because it distills so many of the lessons that I learned from the men who I spoke with. But so for example, and we can talk about some other solutions, but for instance, women are interrupted 3 times more frequently than men. Every piece of research will show you. Northwestern actually did a study of the Supreme Court of the United States and found that the female Supreme Court justices are interrupted 3 times more frequently than the male Supreme Court justices. So it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what station of life, how far you rise. That's what happens. However, once you're aware of this, there's something you can do about it. So I talked to one really successful television producer, a guy named Glenn Mazzara. He's the executive producer of The Walking Dead, and he produced The Shield. And when he was working on The Shield a few years ago, he said, first of all, he wanted women in the writer's room. There's always like a dozen or 15 writers in the writer's room creating scripts. And he didn't, the agencies, the talent agencies, those all-guy Ari Gold people, wouldn't even send him women. And he said they didn't believe him when he said he wanted women. He finally got some women in the writer's room, but realized they were failing. None of their ideas were getting taken. And he said it took him too long to figure it out, but at some point it clicked that the reason was every time these women tried to pitch an idea, they were cut off by the men in the room. So he created a new rule, and the new rule was no interruptions. Whoever's speaking gets to finish, and then he said after that, you can tear them apart, it's fine, you can make them cry, no problem, but you have to let them finish. And it totally changed the dynamic in the room and for those women. And there's another tactic. You've all heard probably of man-interrupting and appropriating, where men interrupt or men get the idea of the woman. And there was a couple of other really cool ideas that came out of that. One was something called amplification. And this actually came from the women in the Obama administration. Obama had more women than any other president before or since. They were getting bulldozed by the men. And so they came up with a system where one woman would say something and another woman would immediately repeat what she said. And that did 2 things. First of all, it gave her credit for what she did, and secondly, it made, so that Bob didn't get credit, and it also, made sure that her idea didn't just die on the vine, that people heard it. And I've talked to male executives. I had a great conversation recently with a top executive from a major packaged goods company. And he said that a woman came up to him on his team, this is senior leadership, he said a woman came to him on his team and said, please notice when we're in our meetings, there's one particular guy and he cuts me off every time I try and speak. So he said, this executive said to me, so he made a secret pact. And the secret pact was every time she spoke, he would listen for the guy interrupting, and he would cut off the interrupter, and he would reinforce her point. So again, there's a lot of things that once you're aware of all of these little biases that we have, that you can do something about.
Last question for me, and we'll turn to the audience. You talked to somebody in the book who, just thinking of solutions we all thought worked, who thinks lean in has actually been a negative for women in the workplace. Explain that, and what do you think?
So this has been an interesting point. There was a Harvard Business School professor, a young Harvard Business School female professor, who was an absolute rock star there. And I heard the same thing actually from a computer science female professor. So these are both areas that are male-dominated areas. And both of them said the same thing, which is that because they're one of the few females in their organization, they are drafted for every committee. They're sent to every conference to be the public face. They have to sit and they're expected to mentor like every woman, whether or not that woman is in their specific field or not. And as this professor said to me, she said, look, lean in is hurting us because it's putting the onus on women to lean in. It's all on us to fix the problem, but also we are expected to alone bring up all these other women. And she said, you know, in her profession, she said, we're judged on publishing and writing. And while my male colleagues are publishing and writing, I'm out there, like, you know, being the public face and doing the mentoring and everything else, and that prevents me from actually doing my job in the first place. And so it will actually hurt my progress. And I thought it was an interesting and valid point. I also think that, you know, men can mentor women as easily as women can. And there are ways to do that, because you also hear about the Penn School, people who are concerned about mentoring, you know, having dinner alone with a woman, men who say, I don't want to, you know, talk to a woman. And there's concerns about that will hurt in terms of mentoring and sponsoring, which is, you know, people who can help you get a job. But it turns out that there are many, many ways that you can do that are highly effective. Including things that my own bosses did for me. Actually, all of my mentors were male. And they did things like, you know, get together with the family. We didn't have to go out drinking or golfing or whatever. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have a viewpoint on the attacks on women's access to reproductive health care and how that has impacted the overall perception of what women should be doing as opposed to what they want to be doing, and how that informs the policies of the companies that you work for.
Look at the culture of the company. So, for example, Apple is, you know, there's an arms race now for a lot of companies to offer more progressive policies for mothers, for fathers, for adoption, which is great, but then you have to look at that in relation to the culture of the place. So, for example, you know, at Alphabet, which owns Google, you have very, very progressive, you know, benefits for new parents. You've got people. There's a guy in the book who I interviewed named Brian Welly, who is just one of the leaders of unconscious bias training, and that's fantastic. But then you have at the top the executive chairman, Eric Schmidt, who says, you know, my ideal worker is someone who works hard all day, goes home to have dinner with their kids, and then gets right back on the computer. Well, that's totally at odds with you know, in other words, he's setting the culture. And the same thing, Apple just unveiled this massive new spectacular headquarters. It's got something like a 50,000 square foot health and fitness center for its employees, but no daycare center. So it really, again, starts from the top of that organization, because nothing else matters if you have a culture where you're not allowing your people to thrive. And one other thing that I will just very quickly mention, there's a whole chapter I call Invisible Women, and that is about women who are more like my age, women who have kids who are in high school or older, who have either stepped back, been mommy tracked, if they could afford it, maybe left the workforce for a few years. But these are women with tons of energy and brilliance and ambition, and who are trying to get back in full time and can't. They just are absolutely invisible to employers, and that's something that I think we really should be focusing on next after you know, maternity leave. We've really got to look at, and parental leave, we've got to look at the other end, which is getting these women back into the workforce or doing something so that they are never so disconnected that they can't step back up again. I've got some figures in there. I think it's $4 trillion or something it would add to the economy. I mean, it's the best possible thing we could do to grow our own economy, is to pay women equally and make sure that we create an atmosphere where they are able to participate fully in the workforce.
Hi, my name is Jen Lord. Thank you for coming today. I had a question, like, what if you don't have a boss like Edward? What if you what if you are in a work culture that is hostile and you feel unsafe in it? How do you then start the conversation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's one that I hear that as I've been speaking about the book. It's been out now for a couple of weeks, and I've noticed very often in the audience, as I've got a very large millennial contingent, and they ask that question every time, because particularly, people coming into the workforce who have grown up in this sort of very, very equal world, and suddenly they run into this wall of institutional sexism that's out there. And then, any one of us can be working in a company with leadership that has this sort of sexism built in. And again, the best possible thing that I think we can do is look for allies. And those allies could be, somebody who is a mentor who you might be able to go to for advice, colleagues to ask for advice. The default, I think, for many people is the HR department. The HR department is not always your friend. I mean, the HR department is there generally to protect the company. But I do find that, and I found it in my own, being a leader in a few different companies, I have found that there have been junior employees who have come to me sometimes with an issue with someone that they're afraid to go to HR, or they fear they won't be heard. And they'll come to me, and I'm glad that they have. You're looking for a simpatico person in a senior position, not necessarily your own boss. These are people who have come to me who are not reporting to me directly. But it has turned out in a couple of these cases that the people they have come to me about actually have a record against them. But in other words, there's already sort of a knowledge. So you can't do anything about the leadership if there isn't knowledge and awareness that something is happening. And so I would say seek out that simpatico, mentor, colleague, whether or not they're your own boss.
Anybody else? Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys.